This is Mr. Eugene, and today we're conducting a thought experiment, one that I think has the potential to create more genuine understanding about the male experience than any serious, straightforward explanation of male disadvantage ever could, because I've learned something over the years of having these conversations. When you explain male suffering directly, people either dismiss it, minimize it, or simply don't have the emotional framework to absorb it. The data doesn't land, the statistics don't move people, the lived experience descriptions get labeled as complaining. So today we're going to try a different approach. We're going to flip everything. We're going to take every disadvantage, every double standard, every area where men are systematically treated as disposable or irrelevant or unworthy of concern, and we're going to ask a simple question. What would happen if this were happening to women instead? Not as an attack on women, not as some exercise in bitterness or point scoring, but as a genuine mirror, because sometimes the only way to make invisible suffering visible is to ask people to imagine it happening to someone they care about. And our society, whatever its many virtues, has made it abundantly clear that it cares about women's suffering in ways it simply does not care about men's suffering. So let's hold up that mirror and see what reflects back. Before we get into this, let me be clear about the tone. This is not rage. This is not a war cry against women. This is a calm, clear-eyed examination of double standards that are so normalized we've stopped seeing them as double standards at all. Men experience these things daily. They're so woven into the fabric of male existence that most men don't even recognize them as injustices anymore. They just accept them as the price of being a man. This thought experiment is designed to make that price visible, to make the invisible visible, and to raise a question that I think deserves a serious answer. If we wouldn't accept these things happening to women, why do we accept them happening to men? Stay with me. The draft and disposability. Let's start with the most fundamental expression of male disposability in our society, the draft. Every young man in this country, when he turns 18, is legally required to register for selective service, required by law under penalty of losing access to federal student loans, federal employment, and potentially facing criminal charges. This registration exists for one purpose, so that if the government decides it needs bodies to send into combat, it knows where to find them. Women are not required to register. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate legal distinction based on a principle so deeply embedded in our culture that we barely notice it anymore. In a crisis, men's lives are available to be spent. Women's lives are not. Now hold that thought and imagine the reverse. Imagine that women were legally required to register for selective service at 18. That failure to do so resulted in loss of federal benefits and potential prosecution. That in times of war, women would be directed to combat roles as needed without option to decline. Think about that for 30 seconds. Really think about it. The organized opposition to this would be unlike anything we've seen in modern political history. There would be legal challenges reaching the Supreme Court within weeks. There would be marches of a scale and intensity that would make previous demonstrations look modest. There would be emergency legislative sessions. Every major media outlet would be treating this as the defining civil rights issue of the generation, and they would be right to respond that way. Because it is a profound thing to say to any human being, your life is available to be claimed by the state in times of need. Your body can be directed into situations where you may be killed. You don't get a vote in this, you just have to be available. That is precisely what we say to 18-year-old boys. And we say it so casually, so routinely, that the young men receiving this message barely register it as the extraordinary thing it actually is. Welcome to adulthood. Sign here to confirm that your life belongs to us if we decide we need it. If we wouldn't say this to women, we need to ask ourselves why we say it to men without a second thought. Dying at work, approximately 5,000 men die in workplace accidents in this country every single year. 5,000. That's not a statistic. That's 5,000 families who lose a father, a brother, a husband, a son. 5,000 funerals. 5,000 lives ended because the work they were doing killed them. These deaths are concentrated in specific industries: construction, mining, logging, fishing, agriculture, transportation, jobs that are physically dangerous. Jobs that happen to be overwhelmingly male. Jobs where the profit calculation apparently favors accepting a certain level of work or death over the cost of making conditions safer. Now imagine those 5,000 deaths were female deaths. Imagine 5,000 women dying on the job every year in industries dominated by women. Imagine what that would look like on the news. What congressional hearings would be called, what regulatory investigations would be launched, what OSHA overhauls would be mandated, what documentaries would be produced, what advocacy organizations would spring up overnight to demand accountability. We know exactly what would happen because we've seen how society responds when female safety is perceived to be at risk. The response is immediate, comprehensive, and treated as a moral emergency. When men die on the job, companies pay out settlements, file the required paperwork, and the world moves on. It's simply the cost of doing certain kinds of work. And the men who do that work, who accept physical risk as part of their daily reality because someone has to and because it pays what it pays, these men are not treated as people making extraordinary sacrifices. They're treated as a line item, 5,000 funerals a year, and it barely makes the conversation. Living shorter lives, men die approximately 5 to 6 years before women on average. 5 to 6 years of life that women have, and men don't. That gap represents an enormous amount of living, grandchildren growing up, years of retirement, experiences, relationships, time. The reasons for this gap are complex and involve multiple factors. Men take more physical risks. Men work more dangerous jobs. Men are less likely to seek medical care. Men are more likely to die by suicide. All of these feed into a mortality gap that has persisted for generations. Now ask yourself, if women were dying 5 to 6 years earlier than men, would we be having calm academic discussions about the complex contributing factors? Or would we be treating it as a public health emergency demanding immediate attention and substantial resources? The answer is obvious. We know the answer because we've seen how society responds to female health disparities. Research funding follows, public campaigns follow, policy follows. The machinery of social concern mobilizes with speed and scale. For men dying years earlier, the response is essentially, well, men make certain choices. Men take certain risks. There are reasons for this. The implicit message being the gap is explainable, which apparently makes it acceptable. A gap being explainable and a gap being acceptable are two completely different things. We've never required female health disparities to be unexplainable before treating them as worthy of serious attention and resources. We shouldn't require that of male health disparities either. The legal system here's one that should generate significant discomfort for anyone who takes equality seriously. Research consistently shows that men receive sentences approximately 60% longer than women for committing equivalent crimes. Not slightly different, not marginally different, 60% for the same offense. Imagine for a moment that the disparity ran the other direction, that women were receiving sentences 60% longer than men for identical crimes. There would be no need to imagine the response. We've seen how our legal system responds when female defendants are perceived to face systemic bias. The response is immediate, vigorous, and treated as a fundamental justice issue. But when the disparity runs the other direction, when men are the ones receiving dramatically harsher sentences for the same behavior, the research exists, the data is published, and the policy response is essentially silence. And then there's family court, where men who have dedicated decades to building a family, who have been present fathers and faithful providers, who have done everything society asked of them as husbands and fathers, walk into a courtroom and discover that the default assumption is that the children belong primarily with their mother, where the burden falls on the father to prove why he deserves equal time with children he helped create and has been raising for years. If women walked into family court and discovered that the default assumption was that fathers got primary custody 80% of the time, that mothers were given weekend visitation and expected to be grateful for it, that a decade of marriage and motherhood could end with a settlement requiring them to pay financial support to an ex-husband who'd already moved on with someone new, there would be no court system intact by morning. The response would be immediate, organized, and absolutely uncompromising. And that response would be entirely justified because what I just described is unjust, deeply, fundamentally unjust. It's also exactly what happens to men every day in courtrooms across this country, with very little organized opposition, because men have been conditioned to accept injustice stoically rather than name it and fight it. Education: women now attend and graduate from college at rates approximately 20 percentage points higher than men. For every 100 women pursuing a degree, roughly 80% men are doing the same. And the gap is widening, not narrowing. When the educational gap ran the other direction decades ago, when women were underrepresented in higher education, the response was exactly what you'd expect. Title IX, scholarship programs specifically for women, targeted recruiting, institutional changes designed to level a playing field that was perceived as tilted against female students. The system mobilized to correct an inequity that was holding women back. Now the gap has reversed and become larger in the other direction. Boys are falling behind in primary and secondary school. They're less likely to graduate high school, less likely to attend college, more likely to drop out if they do attend. And the educational outcomes gap between men and women continues to widen every year. The policy response to this has been essentially nothing, because the narrative of male disadvantage in education doesn't fit comfortably into the frameworks that currently govern educational policy discussions. And so boys continue to fall further behind year after year, while the mechanisms that mobilize so effectively to help girls thrive in education remain largely dormant when it comes to helping boys. This is not a trivial concern. Education shapes life outcomes in fundamental ways. A generation of men who are significantly less educated than their female peers is a generation facing narrowed opportunities, reduced earning potential, and diminished ability to contribute to families and communities. The downstream consequences of this gap are already visible and will become more pronounced over time. Men dying by their own hands, men die by suicide at approximately 4 times the rate of women. Not slightly more, not somewhat more. 4 times. This is one of the most devastating statistics in all of public health. It represents an incalculable amount of suffering, an enormous number of families losing fathers and sons and brothers, a crisis of despair playing out at scale and largely in silence. Now imagine those numbers in reverse. Imagine women dying by suicide at 4 times the rate of men. Think about what the public health response would look like. Think about the research funding that would be mobilized, the public awareness campaigns, the policy changes, the crisis hotlines, the community programs, the institutional responses at every level of government and civil society. Think about how it would dominate the cultural conversation. For men, the response has been modest relative to the scale of the crisis, not non-existent, but modest. Because male suicide, like so much else in the male experience, is treated as a men's issue rather than a human issue. And men's issues, as this thought experiment is designed to illuminate, don't receive the same urgency and resources as equivalent issues affecting women. Add to this that men make up over 70% of the homeless population. More than 7 out of 10 people sleeping on the streets, in shelters, under bridges are men. Men who lost their homes, their families, their financial stability, their footing in society, and they're largely invisible as a crisis because the narrative of who deserves our compassion and concern has been so thoroughly shaped by frameworks that position men as the powerful party who need no help. If 70% of homeless people were women, we would treat it as one of the defining social failures of our time. We do treat female homelessness as a crisis requiring immediate and comprehensive response. Male homelessness at 4 times the rate? It's background noise. Violence against men. Men constitute approximately 75 to 80% of homicide victims in this country. The overwhelming majority of people being murdered are men. Men dying violently at the hands of other people, in numbers that absolutely dwarf comparable statistics for women. Yet the cultural conversation about violence is almost entirely framed around violence against women, which is a real problem deserving serious attention. But so is the reality that men are being killed at rates that make the female homicide rate look, by comparison, dramatically lower. When a woman is murdered, it is news. The community mobilizes. Investigators work the case with intensity. The story gets covered, and that is as it should be. Every murder victim deserves that response. When a man is murdered, when some ordinary man going about his ordinary life becomes a victim of violent crime, the response is far more muted. A note in the police report, perhaps a brief mention in local coverage. The story moves on quickly. Because male victims of violence are somehow less compelling as stories, less worthy of the sustained attention, less capable of generating the social concern that female victims of violence generate automatically. This disparity in how we respond to violence based on the gender of the victim is not just a media failing. It's a reflection of a deep cultural belief that male lives and male suffering are simply less urgent, less important, less worthy of our collective grief and concern. How men are portrayed turn on virtually any sitcom. Watch any family-focused commercial. Observe how men are depicted in the mainstream entertainment that shapes cultural perception. The husband who can't figure out the dishwasher. The father who creates disasters when left alone with the children for an afternoon. The bumbling man-child who requires his competent, eye-rolling wife to manage every aspect of domestic life. The comic relief whose defining characteristic is his inadequacy. It's Homer Simpson. It's every beer commercial dad. It's an entire genre of entertainment built on the premise that men are lovable buffoons who can barely function without female management. Now ask yourself honestly, if this genre existed for women, if the bumbling incompetent were reliably female, if the eye-rolling competent adult were reliably male, what would happen? Boycotts, advertiser withdrawals, industry condemnations, organized campaigns, lawsuits alleging harmful stereotypes, and not without justification, because systematically portraying any group as incompetent buffoons does cause harm. It shapes cultural perception. It affects how that group sees itself and how others see it. The question isn't whether male-negative stereotyping in media is harmful. It clearly is. The question is why it's acceptable when the target is male, when the exact same content would be treated as a social crisis if the target were female. The man-up standard and finally the expectations, the social standard that every man internalizes from childhood. When things are hard, you handle it. When you're in pain, you manage it. When you need help, you find a way to need it less. You don't complain. You don't cry. You don't ask for sympathy. You solve problems and you keep moving. This expectation has virtues. It produces capable, resilient men who contribute enormously to their families and their societies. I'm not saying it's entirely without value, But it also produces men who suffer alone because they've been told their entire lives that suffering out loud is weakness. Men who don't seek medical help until conditions are severe because seeking help feels like failure. Men who carry impossible weights in silence and eventually break under them because they never learned that it's acceptable to put the weight down and ask for help carrying it. Imagine applying this standard to women. Imagine telling women that whatever difficulties they're facing, the appropriate response is to stop talking about it and just handle it. That emotional expression is weakness. That asking for support is failure. That the measure of a real woman is her ability to absorb pain silently and keep performing at full capacity regardless. That would be recognized instantly as a harmful, destructive standard. And the recognition would be correct, because it is a harmful, destructive standard. When applied to men, it is also harmful and destructive. The evidence for this is visible in the suicide statistics, the mental health statistics, the life expectancy gap, the isolation and homelessness rates. Men are paying with their lives for a standard that nobody would tolerate if applied to anyone else. The mirror and what it shows us. So, here's what this thought experiment reveals. Every one of these situations, the draft, workplace deaths, the mortality gap, sentencing disparities, family court, educational decline, suicide rates, homelessness, violence, victimization, media portrayal, the man-up standard, every single one of them would generate immediate, organized, comprehensive social response if the people experiencing them were women. We know this not as speculation, but as observed reality. We've seen how society responds to female disadvantage when it's named and organized around. We've seen the legislation, programs, the cultural shifts, the institutional changes that follow when women's issues receive the attention they deserve. None of that has happened for men. Not because the problems are smaller. By most measures, the problems affecting men are actually larger in scale. Not because the suffering is less real. Not because the social cost is less significant. But because men's suffering has been systematically excluded from the frameworks through which we identify and respond to injustice. Men don't organize effectively on their own behalf. They don't march. They don't build the political coalitions that translate suffering into policy response. They've been taught their whole lives that doing so is weakness, that their pain doesn't warrant that kind of attention, that real men handle their problems quietly and alone. And so the problems persist and grow. And the men experiencing them suffer in silence while the cultural conversation moves on to other concerns. This needs to change, not through bitterness, not through opposition to women, or to the legitimate advocacy that has improved women's lives in real and important ways, but through the straightforward recognition that men's suffering is also real, also significant, also worthy of serious attention and organized response. If we can see clearly how we'd respond to these things if they happen to women, we should be able to see clearly that we should respond to them happening to men. The standard should be the same, the urgency should be the same, the compassion should be the same. Final thoughts. I want to close by saying something clearly. This channel has never been about attacking women or suggesting that women's issues don't matter. Women's issues matter. Female suffering is real and deserves the serious response it receives, but so does male suffering. And the test of whether our commitment to reducing human suffering is genuine, or whether it's really something narrower than that, is whether we can extend the same urgency and concern to men that we extend to women when the numbers are equivalent or worse. By that test, we are currently failing men, systematically, consistently, across nearly every domain of life where men are disadvantaged or suffering at scale. This thought experiment is not a call to take anything away from women. It's a call to extend to men the same humanity we already extend to women, to ask the same questions about male suffering that we ask about female suffering, to mobilize even a fraction of the social energy for men in crisis that we mobilize for women in equivalent circumstances. That's not a radical position. It shouldn't be a controversial one. But apparently, given how little attention these issues receive in mainstream discourse, it's still a conversation that needs to be had. Drop a comment. Tell me where this landed for you, what resonated, what you'd add to the list of double standards that need to be examined. The conversation matters. Subscribe because this channel will keep having the conversations that mainstream media won't dress them up, and won't soften them to avoid discomfort. Men's lives matter in exactly the same way and to exactly the same degree that any other lives matter.